I love boat maps in Fire Emblem. There's something about being on a seafaring vessel that just brings out the inner pirate in me. Whether it's Celica's Act 2 Gauntlet, one of the only good maps in Fire Emblem 7 where you defend against incoming vessels, or situations where you're beset by flying foes like the Raven map in Path of Radiance or Ghost Ship in Sacred Stones, boat maps seem to always deliver. But they also tend to be in short supply. And this makes sense. Most conflicts in Fire Emblem take place on land. That's because battles usually revolve around major landmarks, such as castles or fortresses, and you can't really have that on boats. Instead, boats tend to be taking your forces from one location to another. They usually represent a transition point in the story rather than its primary focus. But the most recent hack I played, Fire Emblem Lord of the Seas, takes that idea and flips the script on it, instead making naval battles the primary focus of not only the story but also the gameplay. And it accomplishes this in two major ways. The first is the setting, as this game takes place on a continent interwoven by multiple rivers. And much of the world's economy, as well as military strategy, revolves around port towns and a robust navy. As such, almost every map that takes place outdoors features some amount of water for your naval units to traverse, whether it be small rivers or large oceans. And this ties into the second way which Lord of the Seas puts a focus on naval combat, the unit design. You see, in addition to the traditional main Lord character, you have a secondary Lord of sorts, which is your flagship, a boat that is auto-deployed on any map with a large enough body of water. And this vessel, named the Thunderhead, attacks with either ballistas, cannons, or just plain old-fashioned bows. Ballistas are, as you can expect, long-range weapons that you can use to snipe enemies on the shore, as well as chip away at other boats. Cannons deal effective damage to armor units, which includes all other ships. And bows are just the cheaper alternative you can use instead of cannons if you don't need to deal effective damage to other ships. But the Thunderhead isn't your only aquatic unit, as the campaign doles out plenty of cast members that are particularly suited for fighting on the Seven Seas. For example, your first flyer has the Shipbreaker as her personal weapon. It deals effective damage to armors, which again includes boats, and has the Reaver effect for fighting against enemy pirates. Speaking of pirates, you also get a pirate with the Acrobat skill early on, letting him water walk at extreme ranges. And speaking of water walking, most infantry classes can do a little bit of water walking themselves, meaning that narrow rivers are easily traversed, and larger bodies of waters can be inched through, or you can give one of your infantry the Venture Blade in order to give them the Acrobat skill and thus turn them into a make-your-own boat. Although speaking of making your own boat, one of the mid-game pre-promotes is a Halberdier who has the ability to summon submarines. Of course, the unit design isn't limited to just aquatic folks, and every member of the cast feels like they fill a unique niche without necessarily having the overly complex design that Skill Emblem can bring to the table. Instead, for the most part, units stand out for a singular important trait. For example, Carly is a mage with the Lock Touch ability, making her the only unit in the game who can open doors without the need for keys or lockpicks. William is an armor knight whose personal weapon, the Bolt Axe, applies the freeze status to anyone he hits with it for 5 turns. The other armor knight, Jules, stands out for being really the only defensively bulky unit you get early on. Of course, while skills, stats, and personal weapons are certainly ways for units to stand out, I think the real interesting and appealing members of the cast are the ones that come with their own unique classes. Especially since these are often classes that are rarely seen in Fire Emblem, especially GBA games. Solane is the poster child for interesting classes, as she is a witch who rides on a broom, and therefore functions as a flying dark mage, complete with staves and all. Armel is a gunner, meaning that she doesn't have access to traditional Fire Emblem weapons, but she can use a pair of twin revolvers, which are a brave 1-2 range weapon that is incapable of quadding foes. Gabriel is a playable ballistician, which is a class that you almost never get access to as a player, and a list of interesting classes wouldn't be complete without touching upon the dagger classes of Ninja, Assassin, and Wolf Knight. Ninjas combine daggers with anima, Assassins combine them with bows, and Wolf Knights combine them with swords, which is the least exciting weapon type, but Wolf Knights are also the only mounted class with water walking, so in my opinion that makes up for the lame secondary weapon. Besides which, you're probably going to be using daggers on them because in Lord of the Seas, daggers are pretty awesome. Much like in Fire Emblem Fates, daggers are perpetual 1-2 range weapons with low might, but they debuff any enemies you strike with them. The particular debuff will vary depending on the dagger you use, but typically it allows for thieves and other dagger units to set up kills very effectively, as they weaken foes and allow others to land the finishing blow. Of course, in Fates, this was the intention behind daggers and shurikens, but realistically, you could just strength stack to allow ninjas to sweep and one-round foes. So here, daggers are given a couple of extra drawbacks. Daggers themselves have very low might, and all of the classes capable of using daggers not only have a low strength base, but also a low strength cap. For example, Thief's strength cap is 10, and Wolf Knight, the promoted variant of Thief, caps out at 15. But if you're worried about your noodle-armed thieves doing 0 damage to enemies, worry not, because daggers do have the additional upside of piercing enemy defenses. As such, your knifey fellows are guaranteed to be able to deal some damage, but unlikely to one-round all but the weakest of foes. I already mentioned that ninjas, thieves, wolf knights, and assassins use daggers, but it's also noteworthy that your main lord is a dagger unit herself. And the unpromoted staffer classes of cleric and troubadour also have dagger access, meaning that you are able to secure kills with your staffers if you want to power level them. Something that I really appreciate because getting stuck on just staff experience can really hurt a unit's long-term viability. Although, speaking of staves in Lords of the Seas, I want to talk about this game's unique approach to staffing. Much like in Fates and Engage, all of the staves have fixed ranges. For example, Silence is 1 to 7 range, Rescue is 1 to 10 range, and Warp is 1 to 5 range. And unlike in Fire Emblem Engage, there's no Makaya emblem in order to let you cheat ranges. Physic will always be 6 range, there's no getting around it. But many of the staff-focused units in your army have their own PRFs to supplement the general day-to-day staffs that any of your mages can use. For example, Gerard can use Condemn to boost his allies' hit and crit by 20, and Solane has the Siren Song, which is an extremely long-range healing staff that is particularly useful given how short-range Physic is in this hack. These personal staffs just further add to how unique members of the cast feel from each other, and that's even before I get into talking about the playable Manaketes. You see, this game has 2 playable Manaketes, but they don't work how you would expect the Dragonkin to function. Instead, each of them starts out in a relatively normal class. One of them is an adventurer, and the other one is a unique wyvern variant with axes and magic. However, once per map, each of them can use their Dragonstone to transform into a unique Manakete form. The adventurer becomes a water dragon, and the wyvern becomes an earth dragon. And this drastically changes their stats, as well as giving them access to a breath weapon instead of their standard tools. The water dragon gains an extreme form of water walking and becomes a glass cannon, with lower defenses but higher offenses, especially speed. Meanwhile, the Earth Dragon becomes the most physically bulky unit you have access to, although he is quite slow and vulnerable to magic. These transformations only last 3 turns, and they come with 2 major drawbacks. The first is that on the turn you transform back into human form, you won't be able to take any actions, and the second is that as long as you're transformed into a dragon, you can't set foot on any indoor tiles, which means on indoor maps the Manaketes can't transform. And you might be wondering, if there's indoor maps, is there dismounting? Well, yes, there absolutely is. Although, I think the version of Dismounting Lord of the Seas has is a little bit sloppy. It ends up feeling more like a buff to cavalry than a nerf to them. They lose movement, but no other stats, so you can very easily just dismount to get around a beast killer and remount the next turn with little to no drawback. It's worth noting that dismounted cavalry do have less movement than the standard infantry move, but only by 1 point, so it's not a huge drawback. And since you don't lose any other stats or weapon ranks while dismounting, like I said, I kinda just used it to get around effective weaponry. My flyers in particular appreciated being able to fly over mountains and then dismount to not take effective damage from bows. Still, while I'm not a huge fan of how dismounting impacted the regular cavalry and flyers, I do think the approach that dismounting took to ballisticians was pretty cool. The one ballistician you have only has 3 movement, but when he dismounts, he actually gains move, he just loses the ability to use ballistas. Instead, he becomes a 6-move archer who can mount up in order to use ballistas on future turns. I'm legally required to like this idea because I did the same thing in a terrible rebalance hack I made a decade ago. Although I can't say the same for every single idea in this hack because I wasn't a huge fan of its communication style, or rather lack thereof. One of the big friction points that I had was running into issues of the game just not giving me the information I needed. For example, there's no text or tutorial that tells you knives pierce defense. Instead, I had to figure that out by just doing some math and realizing that I wasn't taking into account enemy defense with my damage. Likewise, fairly early on, there's a map with a 2-part objective, where you talk to a red unit and then you have to fight a bunch of reinforcements that come from all sides, including some flyers, one of whom has a brave axe. But the game doesn't give you a warning for this until you have already spoken to the red unit in question, and all of the enemies are about to spawn at the end of player phase. Given that this squad includes ballisticians and flyers, and you're likely to have your forces spread out thanks to thinking the map was about to be over, it feels like a very unfair oversight, and that is a consistent pattern. There's a bridge that is considered indoors for the purposes of mounted units, but the game just doesn't tell you this. So if you mount up any of your mounted units, they are stuck as immobile for the next turn. Anytime that brigands spawn, they are always just 1 turn away from destroying houses, so you have to rush in order to intercept them before it becomes a problem. And a lot of maps have get out reinforcements that show up sooner than you would expect without any sort of warning, indicating that you need to rush faster. The game does allow you to infinitely rewind by 1 turn with a functional infinite 1-turn turn wheel, so if you ever get caught really off guard, then you can reset in order to fix things, but it is nonetheless a point of frustration, especially if you're trying to avoid using the turn wheel as much as possible, like I do. While I'm on the topic of frustrations, I might as well get my other 2 negatives out of the way. I wasn't a huge fan of the story in this hack. It is supposedly about a civil war between the protagonist and her brother, but it often just devolved into a series of unrelated side plots, which lasted 2 or 3 chapters before jumping to the next side quest. And even as we were approaching the endgame, where the stakes should be ramping up, most of the conflicts were just against side groups of brigands or mercenaries, rather than the main force of the army that we're opposing. And on that topic, the late game of this hack definitely suffered from bloated map syndrome. Multiple chapters in a row felt like mini FE4 maps, and the hack kind of gave up on its gimmick of making everything naval focused in the last third of the game. In fact, your flagship no longer becomes a force-deployed unit on every outdoor map. Instead, it can be deployed or undeployed like any other unit in the cast, and it gains tread so it can move over land. And as such, the maps are no longer as carefully designed as they were in the earlier mid-game. All of those maps featured a major waterway for the Thunderhead to go down, and bridges for it to weave in between alongside the rest of your naval forces, but here it just kind of becomes an armor knight that knows how to swim. And if there's a waterway, then that's good for it, but in a lot of the maps, there really isn't all that much water. In fact, the final map of the game is an indoor map, so the Thunderhead can't even be deployed, which feels pretty disappointing. Although granted, the map before it was a big naval map, so that in part makes up for it. But having gotten my nitpicks out of the way, I want to talk about the most unique and, in my opinion, coolest system in Lord of the Seas, and that is the way it handles supports. Supports build like they do in Path of Radiance, where two units will gain support points simply by being deployed together in the same map. But the benefits that you get from support conversations are not simply a boost to your hit, crit avoid, attack, defense, etc., but instead a concrete reward that varies depending on the support conversation. A C support gives you a very low value reward, usually just 50 experience to whichever unit initiated the convo. But at B rank support, you get something quite good. Sometimes one of the participating units gets a boost to their stats or weapon experience, and sometimes you get a valuable item. For example, the B support between Jules the Armor and Sierra the Thief gives you a silver dagger. But A rank is where you get the bonkers rewards. For example, if the main Lord Roseanne achieves A support with either of her retainers, David and Isa, they will get access to a boosted version of their personal. Isa now has a shipbreaker that deals magical damage, whereas David's Vindelvoss is now brave. Of course, because of the limitations where you can only gain 5 support ranks with a singular character, each character can only get 1 A support, and oftentimes the best A supports are in competition with each other. But as long as you pursue a pairing of 2 units you plan on using, you are virtually guaranteed to get something worth your while. If you want to make certain you are pursuing the support paths you're most interested in the rewards for, there is a guide in the FEU page that you can consult, but personally, I don't think this is particularly necessary. I think it's perfectly fine to just use whatever units you're using and take advantage of the rewards you get. But you really should try to get an A support on all of your main team members because they're super beneficial. I mean, William gets plus 10 speed out of one of them. That's a ridiculous glow up. The last design element I want to talk about with Lords of the Seas is its approach to Jagens. Because, to be frank, this campaign doesn't really have a traditional Jagen. There are a couple of pre-promotes that join you early on, but they're really more guest characters, because they'll be around for a chapter or two and then leave you only to rejoin later at a more appropriate time for their stats. I think this approach is really cool because it not only gives you the early game crutch without necessarily falling off later, but also makes the mid-game re-recruitment of familiar faces exciting because there's someone you got to taste earlier, and if you liked them, you can now permanently add them to your team. And don't worry, any items they had on them when they left immediately get sent to the convoy, so you don't miss out on them for any stretch of time like you would with Marty or Ocean. Overall, I was a huge fan of Lords of the Seas. It's not a perfect hack, but it definitely had its hooks in me the entire time. I came because I was interested in the naval gimmick, but I stayed because the unique unit design combined with incredibly competent maps gave me enough joy to carry me through a full campaign twice. Because yes, despite having 1.5 million hacks on my to-do list, I was intrigued enough by Lord of the Seas to play through it twice. And if that's not an endorsement, I don't know what is. I want to say a quick thank you to my patrons: Glup Shido, Electric Giga, Erica Ford, YLO1, George Grenville, the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Arvis, Crispy Matthews, Flohay, I Like Rattata, Amy Hazel, Faulty Videos, Lyra, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Anna Cabana, The Daily Foogle, Faye, Magic Bite, Thoughtful Insanity, Robin Goodfeller, Shantia, Sardonic Muse, Dysike, Chris, Root Beer Pants, Queen Eliza, Control Daegis, Roman Kormanzik, Knick-Knack, Hammersmack, Lepton, Cabbage, SUP, Caius Cole, Bree, Punch Fighter Champion, Eggman, Maxine the Vampire Queen, Dragonback Lancer, Carrier Has Left, Jill, Angel Not Caceres, Key the Iron Idol, Calamity Callie, Anom Wanderer, A Clever Username of Lies, Jackson McMahon, Saren Gerlixy, Tailored Muffin, Rezi, Andu, Len, Gameboo, Carosa, Firant, Your Doctor, Frozen Helm, Patwit, Pillow Willow, Girl Boss, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Jaden, Reflect, Dylan Solis, Forever Lucas, Some Trades, Guichi555, Zycrom, Smaz Ruby, Robin D, Alen B, Hound Dogs, They Thumb, Klon, Reflect, and especially my Jagens, Thick Molder, Adele, Alexander Roper, Siggy, and Cereal Bowl. You make this whole YouTube thing possible, especially with the dwindling ad revenue. It's really awesome that you were willing to support me. If you are interested in getting your name in the credits, or just getting early access to videos like this one, plus the ability to vote on stuff in the channel, and maybe some other benefits that are too spicy to talk about on YouTube, then there's a link to my Patreon below, although please only donate if you are comfortable doing so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. Liking, subscribing, all that fun stuff are free ways to support the channel, but regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.